Hola, bon dia. En aquesta entrevista parlaré amb la doctora Serena Olsaretti sobre el tipus de decisió que és tenir fills i filles. A més, també valorarem el paper dels fills i filles en la societat i quina responsabilitat tenen els pares i mares i els que no ho són envers els nous membres d'aquesta societat. També acabarem comentant com s'ha d'interpretar la idea de fair share per a poder pensar el problema poblacional. Serena Olsaretti és doctora en filosofia per la Universitat d'Oxford. Actualment és professora investigadora i crea a la Pompeu Fabra des del 2010. També ha treballat a la Universitat de Cambridge. En els seus diversos llibres i articles tracta temes de filosofia política i moral, i en els últims anys s'ha centrat en temes de justícia i família. Des del 2015 ha sigut la investigadora principal d'un projecte sobre Justice and Family, an analysis of the normative significance of procreation and parenthood in a just society. Vull agrair aquesta oportunitat d'entrevistar la doctora Serena Olsaretti i també us animo a veure els altres vídeos que he penjat, també a personalitats interessants. Espero que us agradi i que os sigui de profit. Pues muchas gracias a la doctora Serena Olsaretti por la oportunidad para entrevistarla. Bueno, las preguntas que le quiero hacer son un poco para reflexionar sobre el problema ético de tener hijos en la situación de la crisis climática. Entonces, yo le voy a formular las preguntas en castellano, pero usted puede responder en inglés si se siente más cómoda, si no es un problema. Entonces, la primera pregunta sería, para poder plantearnos el problema ético de tener hijos ante el cambio climático, primero debemos aceptar que tener hijos es una decisión. Pero, por un lado, hay una decisión a nivel biológico, es decir, que tenemos que decidir si queremos, que la persona la mujer pueda decidir si se queda embarazada o no. Pero aparte de esto también hay la decisión, una vez se queda embarazada, de tener al niño o no. Además, hay otros factores como los culturales o los religiosos que hacen que en algunas culturas, una vez estás embarazada, ya no sea una decisión tener un niño o no. Entonces, ¿qué tipo de decisión es la de tener un hijo o hija y de qué la diferencia del otro tipo de decisiones?
Vale, muchas gracias, Josep. Sí que contestaré en inglés a las preguntas. So I take it that the question you're asking is not a descriptive one about how people go about taking this decision, but about how we should view the decision or the choice of having a child. And I want to separate, so there are these two questions you're raising here. One is about the decision to have a child, assuming that we haven't yet begun the procreative process, and then there is a question about abortion. And I thought of focusing mostly on the former, on what kind of decision is involved in just deciding whether or not to procreate in the first instance. And even there, so focusing on that question, I think it's helpful to distinguish between the three sets of parties whose interests are relevant. One is the parents, or procreative parent in this case, the child, and then third parties. And we're going to talk, I think, about third parties later. So with regard to the child itself, I think what possibly the reason why procreative choices are unique is because it involves, they involve bringing into the world or creating a new person, that's to say, someone with moral status. And there are, in particular, as many people have argued, three features that make this decision unique, right? So you're affecting, we affect other people all the time, other persons all the time in what we do. But in this case, you are, first of all, making an incredibly momentous decision for that person, the possible person, if you decide to bring her into existence, right? So this person will now have a responsibility to live a life, and that can go well, but it can go badly as well. But secondly, this is what's really distinctive, is that you're making this decision without her consent. So it's a hugely momentous decision, but she cannot decide, and you're making that decision for her. And then thirdly, and this is what makes it further or makes it even more tricky, is that you're making a decision that in the best case scenario will be beneficial for her, but not to avoid harm, right? So when you bring a new person into existence, I think there is wide agreement that not existing is not a harm to anyone. And so is it permissible to make a decision on someone else's behalf that is incredibly momentous, and that it's a decision of a risk for her, a risk of harm, which hopefully will not materialize, but not to avoid greater harm. And I think it's these three features of the procreative decision that make it extremely tricky, unique. And as you know, philosophers have, some philosophers in the face of that have said it's impermissible to have a child. I don't think it's impermissible, but I think it does create, place a lot of burden on the procreator.
Thank you. Sí, la segunda pregunta sería, para mucha gente tener hijos es un derecho humano, pero para otros es una mera preferencia que puede ser muy cara para el planeta. Entonces, ¿en qué sentido cree usted que se diferencia la decisión de tener hijos de otras preferencias que también pueden ser caras, por ejemplo?
Sí. Bueno, back to English. I was going to start in Spanish, but I'll go to English. So I think first of all, it's helpful to distinguish between a moral right and a legal right. And we should also distinguish between, or we should keep in mind whether we're talking about whether to have one child or whether the right in question is the right to decide just as many to have as many children as we like. So let me say that with regard to the legal right, so I do think that it's a right that we should uphold, mainly because there is a long history of serious wrongs done to people, often not for good ends, by way of interfering with their reproductive freedom, especially with women. And there are also perverse effects of legal constraints, as we know from the case of, for example, the one-child policy in China. But when we talk about the moral right, I do think that the idea that moral right is unrestricted is false, is problematic, and indeed false. And at least insofar as it involves having as many children as we like. Now, I do believe that, unlike other decisions, there is a sense in which this decision protects a fundamental interest, right? So if you think of something like there are certain interests that are so basic or so weighty, right? So the interests in freedom of association, freedom of speech, and I think procreative freedom is up there with those interests, at least when it comes to the decision or the choice of whether or not to have a child, one child, right? So at least I think we should acknowledge that as a basic interest. But with regard to whether we should have, or we have a right to having, morally speaking, to having more than one child, that's where, as I've said, that the decision is difficult, and it will depend on a number of factors, right? It will depend on just how much the environmental impact of a child is. It depends on where we are, right? So you know, whether there are in the context in which we live other ways of cutting down on emissions. So the level of technology, and these things will determine, right, whether or not it will be morally permissible to have more than one. I do want to say it is important, I think, to avoid some misconceptions here. So I think we should have a very calm and reflective discussion about the moral right to procreate and just how extensive it should be. But I think, and I think it is important to dispel the view that the choice is mine. I think this is a mistake that people make. The choice is mine slides from kind of the legal right to the moral right. So people think I shouldn't be prevented by the state, but it doesn't mean that I have the moral right to do whatever I like. So I think that's one important mistake to avoid here. And another one I think it's important to avoid is I think many people in affluent societies like ours think that the problem of too many children is not our problem, right? Because they think that our fertility is so low already, but they don't realize that the problem of too many children is not about numbers as such, but it's about the impact, including, most importantly, the environmental impact of added children. Yeah, I was going to also add, perhaps it's useful to keep in mind that even in human rights declaration, when in Tehran and Cairo, when the right to decide on children has been affirmed, it's been affirmed in the context or with the proviso that parents have the right to decide on the number and spacing of their children freely and responsibly. So I think we should emphasize that. We should have a capacious understanding of what responsibly means, and try and have a debate about what that means in our context.
Thank you. Very interesting. Sí, hablamos un poco de este tema con el doctor Tim Majors también, también es muy interesante. La tercera pregunta sería, tener hijos, hemos dicho que en parte es una decisión individual, pero que también afecta a otras personas, a una tercera parte, que en general pueden no ser padres o madres. Entonces, ¿qué tipo de afectación tienen los hijos sobre los padres y las madres? Y después, ¿qué tipo de afectación tienen sobre los que no son padres y madres?
Okay, so I take it, the question you're asking here, I think it's mostly a kind of descriptive question. So it's about what are the costs and benefits, right? What is the impact, in fact? And so I'm going to be able to say a little bit, but mostly maybe it's helpful to identify kind of the typology, if you like, that we might use when thinking about these questions, and the methodological point. So let me begin with the methodological point. So I think that when we say what are the costs and benefits to various parties, I mean, there are many costs and benefits, but I think which ones we focus on depends on what question we want to answer, for which the question of which costs and benefits is relevant, right? So for example, if we are interested in asking, say, about the fairness of intra-household distributions of domestic labor, then which costs and benefits, what costs and benefits of having children are for parents is going to be different if we're from the scenario in which we're asking instead about how the cost of children should be distributed across society, right? So for example, let me make that claim more specific. I think with, if we're talking about, say, intra-household distribution, I think the fact that parents derive welfare, right? But both parents derive welfare from the relationship with their child is relevant, but I don't think it's so important when we're talking about inter-households or rather kind of the social divisions of the costs of reproduction. So that's a methodological observation. So I think that there are many costs and benefits which we focus on, both for the parents themselves and for third parties, depends on why we're asking that question, right? What bigger question are we trying to answer? But with regard to just giving you a kind of, not a typology, but just some ideas as to what the costs and benefits might be. So for parents and procreators, we know that they've varied tremendously and across time. And we know that they vary still now across different societies and within societies between different households and within households between the parties and mothers and fathers in particular. And there are material costs, there are emotional costs as well. There are interesting questions which I only know a little bit about as to whether for parents, when it comes to the psychological, if you like, or the immaterial benefits and costs of children, whether those benefits are actually, so what they are depends on, again, what aspects of welfare we're focusing on. So as far as I know, some interesting psychological research suggests that many parents, at least when their children are younger, experience less welfare, right? So they're stressed, they're tired, often they find it hard to reconcile work and outside the house and work within the house. But when it comes to meaning or sense of fulfillment, they have more of that than non-parents. And as for third parties, I'll just say, again, a typology, depends which third parties are we talking about, right? So there are other family members, and here it may be other siblings, or it may be, say, the grandparents, or other members of the extended family who are interested in the families continuing in time. There may be other kind of overlapping generations in one's own community or state. There are overlapping generations elsewhere that are affected. You might say, if we continue, for example, in affluent societies to have children, this has third-party externalities on people born now or 10 years down the line in terms of the effects on climate change, and then future generations that don't overlap with us. So the question is huge. It depends on, what those externalities are, depends on the question we're asking, and also who exactly the parties are in the case of third parties.
Perfecto. Pero entonces, ¿qué responsabilidad tienen los padres y después los que no son padres respecto a los hijos? ¿Hay alguna responsabilidad o?
Okay, so yes, so I mean, so it depends. So the division of responsibilities is a big question. So let's focus. I take it, I mean, a helpful way to begin is to focus on the division of responsibility between parents, and I'm assuming we're mostly focusing on procreative parents, but many of the considerations will apply to adoptive parents as well. So those who are given rights and obligations vis-a-vis the child, that constitute the package of parenting rights, and then the society at large where these parents live. So I think I think what's the answer to how the division of what's the right division of responsibilities depends on the responsibilities in question, and also on the theory of justice, right? So so if we're talking about the socioeconomic costs of the responsibility to bear costs, right? The material costs, and by that I mean something also quite capacious. So we might think of, for example, also the costs in terms of time that we could assign monetary value to, or we could just treat as a kind of distinct resource. But so if we focus on these material costs broadly construed, and how those should be divided between parents and non-parents, the rest of society, I think that as I've said, depends on the theory of justice. So think of, if you're, for example, somebody who believes in equality of welfare or opportunity for welfare, the answer to that will depend in part on the answer to the question that you asked a few moments ago, right? About what are the benefits to parents, because I've mentioned the welfare benefits, potential welfare benefits to the parents. So it may be, it turns out that parents do really well in terms of some measure of welfare, then they would have to bear more costs, right? So as to offset their potential gain, if there were a gain compared to non-parents. But I'm more disposed to answer the question within a broadly resourcist view of justice. So this is a view that says that how we should distribute costs and benefits shouldn't look or shouldn't take as decisive what welfare people get, but rather should use some other metric to determine whether the resources that people have are equal. So the material resources that people have are equal. And so I do think that in that context, I think the fact that parenting is socially necessary work, right? So that it's under many conditions, not all, but under many conditions, it's a productive, it's effectively a productive choice. You're doing work that is socially valuable or indeed indispensable to maintaining social institutions. That's relevant for determining how the costs and benefits should be distributed. So with regard to the costs of raising children, at least some of them, not necessarily all the costs that parents choose to lavish on their children or to incur to lavish on their children lots of goods, but at least in terms of the costs needed to give children what they have a claim to get, I think at least with regard to those, this should be divided so that between parents and society at large, at least to the extent that the division doesn't leave parents worse off than other producers of goods, right? So the fact that you are doing something that is socially necessary means that we should find a way of measuring what the value of your contribution is, which some social scientists are working on. And then we should ensure that you're not penalized relative to others who have productive ambitions that are well rewarded on the market in important ways. So that's roughly kind of the answer that I would give. But let me emphasize, Giuseppe, that this doesn't mean that parents don't have special responsibilities. So there are going to be lots of costs, I think, that that will fall on parents. So starting, as I've said, there are many costs that parents choose to bear on their children that are in a way, optional, right? So, and those, I think, rightly fall on the shoulder of parents. And then there are costs that are, if you like, integral to the very value of the project that parents embark on, right? So it would be, I take it nonsensical for someone to say that they have a right to parent a child, but that they want to be exempt from the cost of having to spend any time with their child. Right? So some of the costs are going to be integral, and if you're a procreative parent, as I've said earlier, I think because it's such a momentous decision, you have special responsibilities to ensure that your child's well goes as well as it takes for the procreative choice to be justified in the first place.
Perfect. Thank you. So now the question would be, do these responsibilities change in a situation of climate disaster or overpopulation?
Yes, I mean, I'm open to this. Like, as I've said, I mean, I'm open to this for independent reasons. That's to say, independent from the account of parenting as socially necessary, right? So you might think, look, even if, suppose that here and now in our society, it's still the case that having and raising children is socially necessary work. Still, it might be that this has terrible effects for some, third party, right? So then, even though it remains in one describable sense, socially necessary for us, right? If it was to avoid catastrophic disasters elsewhere, we may well have an obligation to certainly reduce the number of children we have. I believe we do have that moral obligation. But even within, you could say that even within the scheme of cooperation within which we're asking whether what we're doing is socially valuable, that whether or not it counts as socially valuable having X number of children will vary depending on on things such as whether, you know, there is a terrible effect of our having so many children, right? So I think that the idea of acknowledging that we should, under normal circumstances, share the cost of children because this is a socially valuable, indeed necessary activity, is compatible with, and in fact, under some circumstances, itself kind of underpins the idea that when circumstances are such and such, you know, when certain very serious negative effects follow from us having too many children, then, you know, it's justified, morally speaking, to say that we have an obligation to have fewer children, and maybe for policies to be designed so as to not pay or not to share the costs of parents, regardless of the number, right? So we could have a kind of share the cost of children of the first child, and then assuming that the child's interest isn't harmed, the second child's or benefits for having a second or a third child should go down. That's, I think, compatible with that argument. But let me just say one more thing. So I've said too many children because I'm assuming that there is a sense in which, as far as at least a kind of anthropocentric conceptions are concerned, having some children, some number of children is always by somebody. It doesn't have to be us. Maybe we can have children, you know, have demographic renewal by having migrants, but someone must be having children. So some social reproduction, or some reproduction is always necessary.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, the last question would be, when we usually talk about these topics, we usually say that adding a new children to this world is a way of wresting a part of the fair share of adult members from a fair share of resources. So they have to live a life with less resources because someone decided to add a new person to this world. So I would like to ask you, what do you think about this idea of a fair share, and if you like the idea, or what is your view about this?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. And so there have been people who, you know, stipulate that or make us think about this by saying, look at non-parents. They've been given their fair share. Now somebody decides to have a child, their fair share shouldn't go down, right? But I think that view, or that way of thinking about things, and therefore the conclusion, is either question begging or wrong, right? So it's question begging because, in a way, the question that we have to ask, well, not in a way, the question we have to ask is the question of whether, is the question of what our fair share is, given that people are reproducing themselves all the time, right? So we can't, so that way of thinking, in a way, begs the question by saying, but it was my fair share. Well, it wasn't your fair share. We need to know what your fair share is, assuming that what is unavoidably the case, namely that people are constantly coming into existence, right? So if we look then at that dynamic context, right? So if we don't just start off with this kind of time slice picture where people have a fixed initial share that is stipulated to be the fair one, if we instead look at the dynamic context and we're asking, you know, what the question would be, you know, what number of children should we assume that people are allowed to have, given certain background assumptions about how this affects the level of well-being that any one of the existing persons can have? So what number of children should we assume it's permissible to have so that people's fair share is of the desirable size, right? So that's really the question we have to be asking. And then I think that what we should do, I mean, that's a very complex question, but I think what I would resist is so I do believe it's important to ask that question, but we should resist the idea that that fair share should be set, if you like, at an optimal level. So we shouldn't think, look, we should have whatever number, anybody, I mean, non-parents or parents, have a claim to having the population or the fertility rate be at that level at which the fair share that we each have is optimal. That I don't think that's true, right? And I mean, and that's, as I've mentioned, something that is false of non-parents, but also of parents, right? So I don't think that parents have a complaint. Suppose that if people who want to be non-parents, if they had children, suppose for a moment that these children would be public goods in the sense that it would actually boost aggregate level of welfare. So everybody's fair share would go up. I don't think that parents in this scenario could say that non-parents are violating the parents' claim to a fair share, right? So just like I think the non-parents doesn't have a claim to a fixed or optimal fair share, right? Such that if now there are more children than is required to bring this optimal level, and everybody's fair share or the non-parents' fair share goes down as well. So I think the parent doesn't have a complaint against the non-parent when the non-parent choosing to not have a child doesn't bring the parents to the optimal fair share level. So I think that we shouldn't think of the claim to a fair share in these maximizing terms, right? Instead, I think our claims to a fair share has to be constrained by acknowledgement that some basic interests have to be at least, minimally satisfied, right? And I think we think the same about other things. So think of the interest in freedom of occupational choice, right? So we don't think, look, people have to work at occupations such that our fair share is maximal, right? So if some people choose to work at less productive occupations, and therefore, we have, let's assume, simple kind of causal connection between that and economic growth and our fair share, we don't have a complaint. We can't say that that people ought to be working in their most productive occupations. So I think that the fair share idea has to be thought about carefully with these concerns in mind.
Okay. So thank you. This will be all. Muchas gracias, doctora Serena Olsaretti, por tus respuestas y por el tiempo. Y si quieres podemos dejar la entrevista aquí.
Perfecto, muchas gracias a ti.